The 1600s, coffee is spreading around the world, especially from Arab and Islam culture. Why? Because, in Christian culture, being drunk is not an issue, a stance that Protestants would later oppose. In Christian culture, being drunk is not a big problem. However, in Arab and Islam culture, they do not like being drunk very much. This is because alcohol is considered haram. In fact, alcohol is gradually being completely banned. Before Islam, Arab culture consumed wine. They enjoyed it quite a lot, because there was already a culture inherited from Rome in the region. There were also wines coming from the Jews, and they drank wine. But the Arabs need another drink, and it has to be pleasurable. It also needs to stimulate the mind instead of dulling it. Coffee. Coffee is very much loved in the Arab world. There are two legends about the introduction of coffee to the Ottoman Empire. A legend says that it came through the governor of Yemen in the 1550s. Another story claims that two merchants from Aleppo opened a coffee house in Tahtakale, which is today's Tahtakale in Istanbul, and in 1555, coffee somehow entered the Ottoman Empire. After coffee arrived in the lands of the Ottoman Empire, it quickly made its way to the palace, but keep in mind that at that time, coffee was consumed bitter, so they do not add sugar to it. There is no story of medium-sweet coffee, and the bitterness of the coffee is appreciated. How does the palace manage the bitterness? They cope by sweetening it with Turkish delight in the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire is also very much loved. Let us not forget that during that time, the Ottoman Empire was aware of a breakfast culture, but it was not a culture of sitting down with tea to have breakfast, which I will explain shortly, about the breakfast culture in Europe. Therefore, coffee is very high up. In fact, the reason it is considered coffee under is as follows. In Europe, coffee is consumed to wake up. It is not certain here, but coffee is presented as a product that is consumed to help one get out of bed and feel more alert. Of course, there are many variations related to coffee. Now, the surprising part is that while we were introduced to coffee in the 1550s, Europe was still not drinking coffee even 100 years later, in 1650. They were using coffee as a medicine. They believed it was a medicine. But 50 years later, in the 1700s, it became a drink of the bourgeois class, in other words, of the palace. Meanwhile, the term bourgeois later came to imply a sense of aristocracy and sophistication. Normally, bourgeois is the opposite. But anyway, the bourgeois, meaning the people, the palace, the administration, and those who enjoy luxury, were drinking coffee. As a privilege, in the 1700s, a new competitor emerged for coffee. Around the 1750s, cocoa. Actually, it was coming from South America at that time. From Mexico, cocoa was very beautiful because it was both drunk and eaten, although eating it would be discovered later. But on the one hand, cocoa did not contain caffeine to the same excessive degree as coffee, so it did not provide extreme alertness, did not startle you, and did not disturb your sleep. On one hand, it provided vitality and energy. While coffee was believed to draw water from the body and reduce sexual power, cocoa was thought to enhance sexual power during that time. While coffee was competing in the league of non-alcoholic beverages, Europe's alcoholic beverage culture revolved around wine and beer. Imagine the Middle Ages in this context. Feudalism exists, and feudalism wants this. Everyone should work as our slaves, on their own land. Here is the voluntary slave, and let them give us a large portion of all the grains they have harvested. Long live the kings and the lords. Now, this people must not rebel. Every now and then, you see that the situation is going badly. A festival, they call it a festival. You are fabricating a holiday. Come on, we will celebrate this. In 1660, there were 103 holidays a year in Paris. Oh, teacher, are you saying it's 103 days? Because in 2019, we had 121 days off in Turkey. But don't forget this, a large portion of those 121 days were weekends. In the Middle Ages, there was no concept of the weekend, since weekends were not recognized. Without electricity, light was provided by candles. Evenings were not important. This is why two cultures had developed. One has no weekends at all, work completely. There is a part that goes to church only on Sunday. There is no concept of night. In fact, they should not go home because they cannot work in the fields during the day. A tavern, which is now a bar. They were going there to drink. Bars and taverns were very important to prevent the public from rebelling, but generally, festivals and feasts were organized. At these feasts, you will also serve alcohol to the people, because if the people come together and say that the king is ruling us very poorly, we should rebel, then you will have a problem. Plenty of wine, plenty of alcohol, beer is bearable for the people. Islam culture does not recommend eating or drinking in the mosque. In other words, it is not acceptable to say, let's have some coffee after performing these 2 rakats. However, in the church, wine was served during the ceremonies. In fact, as you go further north, you see the individual in the ritual cultures of that period. Until potatoes became common among the people, 3 liters of beer were consumed daily in Central Europe. An English family, until the second half of the 17th century, had potatoes on the table, which I refer to as enriching the table, meaning there was beer and bread. Look, breakfast, lunch, and dinner consist of beer, bread, and if available, meat, root, vegetables only come in later. Even children were drinking an average of 3 liters of beer a day. This was because beer was not consumed at that time with the intention of getting drunk. After a while, the public began to degenerate. In European culture, beer continues to be prevalent. Germans still consume a lot of beer. When you head north, there is also a beer culture in Scandinavia instead of wine or whiskey. Of course, the wealthy were moving away from beer and turning to more expensive drinks. Going back very far in time, the product that Greece exported the most for many years was wine. However, Greek wines were very expensive. Beer and bread were made at home. It was the women's job to make beer. In the 16th century, the people's minds were always clear. Just like there will be a video about drugs in the 19th century. In the context of global trade, in the 19th century, 1/3 of the population in China was constantly under the influence of opium due to the impact of the British. Let me explain to you England's perspective on China and India. From the early 19th century, England was transforming into a great colonial empire. When I say England, I actually mean Britain. I already explained the differences between Britain, the United Kingdom, and England in the Brexit video. At that time, they are so ruthless and exploitative that they think to themselves, someone suggests to the king, what if we make all the Chinese wear garments that are a finger long? The looms in all of Manchester would be rich for centuries. That's why they say we should constantly change the culture of the Chinese. Let's make the mind beautiful. Let's take the gold from their hands. Let's keep giving them opium, clothes, reform. Drinking did not always flow as freely as water. This was especially true in Germany, where the church had become very corrupt. The same was true for all of Europe. We divide Christianity of that period into 2, Orthodoxy and Catholicism. The center of the Catholics is in Rome, where the Vatican is located, and it is led by the Pope. The Orthodox are the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. Where is the Ecumenical Patriarch? In Istanbul. In that period in Constantinople, in 1517, Martin Luther emerges. Do not confuse Martin Luther with King. He does not mix up the struggle for the rights of black people, much later either. Martin Luther nails a declaration of 95 theses to the church door in Germany. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with our topic? Martin Luther has 4 points among these 95 that greatly question the power of the church. The church constantly tells people to eat and drink, to be happy. Oh, of course, they say they will forgive your sins and sell indulgences from heaven. Martin Luther says, 1. No one can enter God and the Quran. 2. Only God can forgive sins. 3. The papacy has no authority to grant absolution. 4. Religious figures who sell indulgence certificates are fraudulent and guilty. So what do we care about Martin Luther? Because Martin Luther, with this movement, says that alcohol should be consumed less. The public should not be in a state of intoxication. This, of course, goes against the Pope. The Pope excommunicates this. In 1687, 150 years later, a man named Edward Lillois opens the first Starbucks in London. Don't be fooled by my mention of Starbucks. It actually opens the first coffee house. Its purpose is to sell coffee and create a space where open-minded, intelligent people like sailors, captains, and insurance agents can come together and constantly discuss business, and it works. It works so well that suddenly 7 or 8 coffee houses open on every street. Lilloit owns most of these and manages many of them, but the main center is the coffee house that he first opened. Those who come here constantly talk about what has been discovered here, what is cheaper there, how they can organize a campaign, how they can also get involved, that they have a ship, and that they can insure those ships. As they engage in these conversations, they start to buy and sell this information. Because he is the only person who is there 24 hours a day? Okay, I exaggerated, but as long as it is open, and he is even creating a news system called Liloit News. After a while, it grows so much and becomes so wealthy that it is now the biggest name in the world in areas such as insurance, marine insurance, and maritime trade law. In the realm of coffee, everyone knows Liloit Insurance. They know Liloit. The modern cafes and patisseries we see today first appeared in Vienna in the 17th century. Because it is now necessary to offer more sugary foods alongside coffee, because there is only coffee to accompany coffee. But women cannot enter the coffee house. What should be done instead? Interestingly, women run the bars. This is because women make the beer at home. In coffee houses, however, men are in charge. The consumption of something alongside coffee by women begins in Vienna, particularly in the context of pastry. At that time, all cups were without handles. In fact, there's an interesting piece of information. The coffee plate under the coffee, the one under the coffee cup, back then, it was much deeper and more like a bowl. Their main function is to pour the hot coffee there, let it cool, and then swirl it around before drinking. Later, despite becoming functionless, it flattens out, and eventually remains flat. The handle came much later. Even during the Ottoman Empire, coffee was always held in this way, served hot and consumed, or held with its saucer. Generally, those cups are covered with a sleeve made of copper or silver. So, the sleeve I mentioned is a second cup on the outside. Silver protection. When you look at the 17th century, the English and the French have direct colonies from which they can obtain coffee. They bring it directly. However, the Germans have no colonies. The Germans buy coffee at exorbitant prices from the English and the French. Especially the French sell it to the Germans with great enthusiasm. Since the Germans noticed the money going abroad and the imports they were making, after a while they said, let's promote beer to the public as beer production is cheaper. And they tried to exclude coffee culture. They imposed bans so that the public would not drink coffee. They are enforcing restrictions and the public is increasingly turning to illegal coffee, avoiding taxes. They say, we are banning it, but people are drinking their illegal coffee without paying taxes. So they invent something called Hindi bar coffee. Dandelion is a slightly cheaper solution, an alternative solution, and they are promoting dandelion coffee. Since the people do not have much of a taste for flavor, they accept whatever they can find to eat, even if it is donkey meat. During this period, there is a return of the English five-cheese incident. Between 1700 and 1750, the French and Dutch began to cultivate coffee in their colonies. The English did not do this. They continued to obtain coffee from their colonies in some way. And they see that, incredibly, they are paying money for coffee. They are paying, which means they are being exploited. They buy it cheaply, but they still buy it, and the people consume it. They are pressuring society to shift from coffee to tea. They increase tea consumption to such an extent that they create excuses like English tea and afternoon tea to make tea more popular in society. Don't think that tea is very cheap. When purchasing tea, they source it from the Far East, specifically from China. Despite being twice as expensive as coffee, 1 kilogram of tea did not yield the same product as 1 kilogram of coffee when produced. While one produces 1 unit, they were obtaining 4 times more product because they brewed it with fewer leaves than tea. Therefore, coffee, which was twice as expensive, was actually cheaper when compared to tea, from which you received 4 times more product. This is why, logically, tea was cheaper. In this video, we explored tea and coffee together. In the next video, we will focus on cocoa.